Hello there, Alaskans, wherever you are. Welcome to the Must Read Alaska Show. Coming to you from somewhere in Alaska. This is the place where we talk about, you guessed it, Alaska. Where we keep the mainstream media on their toes and where we are standing up for what's right in a world run by leftists. You can find out more by heading over to mustreadalaska.com and also checking out the Must Read Alaska YouTube channel for some really great content. But first, let's get this party started.
Well, welcome everybody to the Must Read Alaska Show. I'm your host, John Quick, coming to you live from somewhere in Alaska. And if you've tuned in today, you get a special treat. We have a double header today. I had Simon on earlier today, who's the chief White House correspondent for Today News Africa, which is one of the biggest news conglomerates in Africa, which is very exciting. He's there in DC reporting on the things happening in and around the Joe Biden administration. And he had a really awesome story to share about how he got to the US and what it's been like for him here as the chief White House correspondent for the news station that he represents. So if you get a chance, go back and listen to that episode. It was pretty enlightening and pretty cool to sit there and listen to a guy that really has had a great experience here in the US. So, but without further ado, we have a special guest today, Scott Kendall, who is one of the main orchestrators behind ranked choice voting. He also successfully passed another ballot initiative that had to do in Bristol Bay with the salmon and pebble mine there. And he's been the chief legal correspondent for Lisa Murkowski and been the chief of staff for Governor Walker. He's been a whole bunch of different things. So without further ado, welcome, Scott, to the Must Read Alaska Show.
Thanks, John. It's good to be here.
Well, Scott, for folks that have been, like I like to say, living under a rock or in a closet, tell people just briefly, kind of in your explanation of why you got involved with ranked choice voting in the first place and why you think it passed and was successful passing, I don't know, 9 months ago or whatever, or not 9 months ago, maybe 5 months ago on the ballot in November.
Well, we used it for the first time. It went remarkably well. I became involved because I had seen election results that were, I think, aberrant. And by aberrant, I mean they seemed to defy or at least potentially defy the will of a majority of the people. And Alaska's got a bit of a history with that, of course. There's two elements here. There's the closed primary, which we've only had very recently since 2000. And then there is the spoiler effect that you can get in a general election where under the old system, you could win with any amount as long as you had the most. If there were 4 people in the race, theoretically, you could get 27% of the vote and win. We had a big history with that. We had, for example, Governor Knowles, of course, kind of won famously because the Republican Party fractured at the time. We had
what did he win? Didn't he win by something crazy like 500 votes or?
Yeah, several, maybe even 200 or 300. I'll have to go check the math, but no question that he won because of the spoiler effect. We had kind of a lesser version of that with Senator Ted Stevens. Ted Stevens was defeated by Mark Begich. I think he was defeated by Begich by about 3,000 some votes. Well, the reality was Bob Byrd ran to the right of Ted Stevens, mostly on choice, but generally to the right of him, took 15,000 votes. Also, again, no question there, without Bob Byrd in the race, Ted Stevens wins. And the Senator Murkowski's, famous write-in, we had something that sort of, it turned out to be the will of the people, I think, but we had an issue where, she lost her primary narrowly to Joe Miller. And then we had a 3-way race. Now she won with about 39% to Joe Miller's 35%. And then you had Scott McAdams for the Democrats down there in the 20s. But you could imagine, sort of the margins were close enough. You could imagine any of those 3 winning. And, approximately 60% of the state could say, what the heck? That's not the person I wanted to win. So it really, to me, it was a twofold problem. It was the closed primary where 8 or 9% of the electorate decides who's on the ballot in the general election, and then the general election allowing for spoilers, which of course we've seen that one side or the other will encourage or entice in a Green Party candidate or a Libertarian candidate to damage the other party's candidate that's not democratic in my mind. That's not representative. So really, ballot measure 2 was sort of a tool to create an unhackable election system where people couldn't use basically dirty tricks to win when a majority of the people didn't want it.
So do you see this being reproduced all over the US eventually? I know that there's a couple of states that have got on board with it, and different counties and municipalities around the US that have kind of testing it out. But do you see this being the new law of the land 10 years from now?
I don't. I think it's that whole I'm a fan of federalism, by which I mean I'm a fan of states to the extent possible doing it their way. Is it going to be the right thing for every state? I doubt it. I don't think California is going to fall over itself to enact something like this, because I think they've got Democratic Party governance and that's what they want, and the leaders there won't let it happen. In a state like Alaska, we're uniquely suited, where about 60% of us don't really affiliate with either party, even though, and I think we arguably as a state as a whole have a center right sort of perspective. It depends on the issue. When you look at issues of privacy, we tend to kind of go much more to the middle. When you look at issues of resource development, we move over into a pro-development stance. So I think it fits us like a glove, but it's gonna be different state to state what works, what doesn't. And whether they want open primaries, whether they want ranked choice voting. Of course, Maine has just ranked choice voting, but they have closed primaries. So that's very different. You look at somewhere like Georgia, they have these runoff elections, which are, there's no primary, they just have the election and then they have a runoff, which is very strange. And then of course you got to run a second election in December. I can't think of anything worse than having to run a whole separate election. So this is obviously, ranked choice voting is a tool that could actually sort of, for efficiency's sake, and not let sort of one party carpet bomb for one race, as we saw, I think, in the U.S. Senate race there between Warnock and Herschel Walker. We saw, I don't know what it was. I wouldn't surprise me to hear it was $1 billion, but
lots of money.
Putting people through that. I mean, could you imagine going into December and across Thanksgiving, there's another election coming? I can't imagine anything worse.
So what do you say to the folks? I think one of the biggest arguments that I've heard against ranked choice voting, and this is from people, just everyday folks that I've run into here in Nikiski and across Alaska, is it's too complicated, and they don't quite understand it. What do you say to those folks?
I mean, I don't concede that it's complicated, but I do concede that it's different, right? It's just not what we're accustomed to. We're accustomed to making that binary choice, and it forces us to say, this person's my favorite. I don't love these other two people, but gosh, I sure do have a preference between them. And so it's a little bit of a different way of thinking. And it is a shift, when you have someone who's 65 years old and for 40 some years they've been voting a certain way, it's a shift. I don't think the open primary is much of a shift, because Alaska used to have a version of that. So I think that part is, if anything, it's simpler, because you're not choosing from different ballots. If you're a nonpartisan, there's one ballot. The ranked choice voting just takes that little bit of shift in your mind. But honestly, Australia, Ireland, they've been doing it for 100 years. I don't think they're inherently any smarter than we are. Yeah, I'd like to think so. And I do think that at the end of the day, I think there was frustration, and understandable frustration, by the delay in tabulation. That's something that can be changed. So I understand that part of the angst. But I think in terms of, this is my favorite, this is my second favorite, we think like that all the time. So I don't think it's a insurmountable shift for folks to make. And the data showed the spoilage rate of ballots was as low or lower than a conventional election. So when push came to shove and people looked at the ballot, they seemed to know what to do.
Yeah, I think I don't blame the Division of Elections for any of this, because it was their first go at it. But it would be really awesome to get some sort of a feel for what came in that night, as opposed to having to wait 3 weeks. And I'm sure that it'll evolve and change, and they'll get better as time goes on. It was their first run at it, so I'm not throwing any stones at them, but I think that was a frustration for folks, and I think it'll be improved down the road, definitely.
Yeah, 100%. I would echo what you say, which is the Division of Elections, not only implemented a new system, they did it twice with the passing of Don Young. So my hat's off to them. That being said, I think two slight changes would make the experience better. First of all, we could do what Florida does, which is basically pre-canvass every ballot we can pre-canvass, meaning more of those absentee ballots get counted on election night. So, rather than 60% of ballots counted on election night, you push way up towards 90%. That gives you a better feeling. But the other part of it is there's not actually a reason under ballot measure 2 they can't run a tabulation on election night. That won't be final, just like it, our elections were never final before 2 weeks before. It's just it gave us a feeling for where things were. And I think we could have seen, for example, a good example would be the Murkowski-Chewbacca race. I think if people saw those tabulations and saw, oh, holy cow, there goes 90% of those votes to Lisa, she's going to be this much ahead. It just lets you call races earlier and move on with life rather than, creating an artificial mystery box when, those votes are cast. The division knows what they say. Just let the people see it. Just, make sure you communicate this is not final till it's final.
Yeah. And it never really was final until weeks later anyway. So
right.
I think that that'd be a good move on the division of elections if they move towards that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the state politics, just to get your take on, what do you think are a couple things the Alaska Senate and House could accomplish this year? I think the last couple years have been frustrating for folks, as sometimes the House hasn't even organized for, I don't know, weeks and weeks and weeks, it seems like. And this year, hopefully, looks like maybe they could get some stuff done. What do you think they could do this year? And a couple, 2 or 3 things that you think would be important out the gate for them to get done.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like you do, like, boy, seeing the Senate organize almost immediately, that did my heart good. The House itself, got organized right quick. That was very positive. They didn't really lose a step. And I mean, they've got some things to wrestle with, but I think the field of dispute is narrowing. I think we're starting to see sort of a, what we didn't see 3-4 years ago, which is this broad agreement that POMV is POMV. We're not going to overdraw the permanent fund. That seems to be kind of a widespread view now, is here are the tranches of money we've got. Now that we've agreed on kind of the size of the income, now we know the size of the problem. The war in Ukraine obviously has created a little bit of an issue for the state in that, very predictably, even though we said we'd never do it again, oil hits $130 a barrel and people go a little nuts. We've now got a budget that balanced and had a surplus, and we're barely going to skid in there with kind of maybe a tiny deficit, but like that surplus vanished. And, I don't know how many times we're going to say it, but, oil prices go up and down. The POMV is a big shock absorber, though. So we've got that and by POMV, of course, I mean the percentage of market value, the permanent fund acting as an endowment and spitting out a predictable amount of money every year. And as long as we don't overdraw it, it will do that every year, and it will grow a little bit every year. So I think that being kind of screwed down is huge. Now the state has to kind of pivot and look at what are we going to value. I think there's kind of broad agreement. We've got to look at education funding. That BSA is out there. Now there's a tension, of course, between how big a boost and are we going to have accountability measures. But I think everyone kind of realizes when you freeze funding for a decade, we got a bit of a problem. But we have a performance problem as well. So that tension is going to be interesting, but I think productive. I think you will see things move forward on education in more than just kind of a soundbite way. And I think that'd be very positive. I do think they've got to deal with the retirement system. It's, whatever you think of prior systems, certainly I know people who have tier 1 retirements and good for them. Tier 1 is not something we'll ever be able to afford again. But people don't realize, we have teachers and policemen who don't get Social Security. So when we give them essentially just a 401k, it's just not competitive. I mean, I don't know how many troopers I talk to who are like, I'd love to stay here. I'm 5 years in. I'm going to Seattle. And so we've got to find some way to compete. And I have seen, the actuarials that show we can provide a better retirement system for not more money. We just have to be smarter with our money. So the fact that those discussions are actually happening and not in the sense of people shouting from their corners, I think enormously important and productive. The biggest issue, I think, is workforce, though. And yeah, that's tied to the other two issues because, of course, education ties to workforce in the future, retirement systems, it ties to workforce, but only for public employers. I'm talking about, the workforce crisis we've got writ large, which is right now already employers are just struggling to get anyone to show up. And that's a multifaceted problem. But what people aren't thinking about is because of the good work of our delegation, we have billions of dollars coming to our state, tens of thousands of jobs. And it's going to be a great tragedy if all those jobs go to people from outside, come here, do the work, and leave versus, giving those jobs to Alaskans, but we got to have Alaskans ready to work. And that's, education, career and technical education, and really it's housing and childcare. Like, you can't tell someone to go to work and earn less than their childcare costs. That's not how capitalism works. No one's going to do that. They're not going to work to lose money. So we've got to find a way. And there's there's 100 potential solutions, but we've got to find a way. Maybe that's tax breaks for companies that provide it. Maybe it's some subsidies at the margins, but we've got to kind of wrestle that to the ground, ASAP, because those jobs, that funding is coming, and we don't have the workforce to support it right now.
So speaking of potential jobs that are coming, how big do you think it is for Alaska to get this? I believe it was 285 million that Senator Murkowski and my guess is Senator Sullivan helped secure for the state of Alaska for the ferry system.
I think that's huge in the sense that it's also a multiplier. It's, first of all, we need those ferries are infrastructure for us and for Southeast, but also, the jobs building, maintaining, operating the vessels, that's a huge engine of economic opportunity. It's going to expand tourism. So I think, $250 million sounds like a lot of money, but that money will have a multi-billion-dollar effect. And of course, the state's got to come in and match some of that money. So hopefully we don't let any of that slip away, because I think that could be a huge deal for Southeast in particular, but statewide.
So I was talking to Ivan Moore yesterday. I had him on the show, and he told me a stat that I was not aware of, which is Congresswoman Mary Peltola has a 56% approval rating. How well of a job do you think Mary's doing or not doing, and why, just from your standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a work in progress. I think we're all still sort of adjusting. It's like moving to a new house. Don Young's always been there, and it's still very strange for me. I'm looking over here at a picture of me and Don Young together at his office, but and I don't know Mary well. I know most people. I've met Mary maybe once or twice, but I will say, putting rhetoric aside and tweets aside, when I look at on the ground, things like hiring Josh Revak, those seem to be not only shrewd moves politically, but anyone who knows Josh Revak, if you know him, incredibly hard worker. And when he worked for Don Young and Dan Sullivan, incredible constituent work. So, not only is that a smart political move, hey, hire one of your Republican opponents, but holy cow, constituent work in a small population state is the bread and butter of a congresswoman. So to me, those outward appearances appear to be real smart moves. Now there's going to be a lot of tough votes, so we will see. Long way to go there, but I think that, the robust support of the Willow Project, if she and Senator Murkowski can influence the Biden administration to make sure the Willow goes forward, those are some pretty nice, that's a couple of touchdowns on the board, I would say.
So, somebody could look back. I like, I've had a conversation with folks who don't live here, and they're like, I can't describe Alaska because in terms of politics, because you have, in November, you have Dunleavy who won, who's unapologetically pro-life. You have Murkowski that's a moderate kind of in the middle. And then you have Mary Peltola, Congresswoman Mary Peltola, who's unapologetically pro-choice. Huge, broad spectrum of ideas, all three won. What do you think this says about Alaska and politics?
It says, two things. I mean, I think first of all, the polling shows Alaska is on balance a pro-choice state. The number's been in the 60s for a couple of decades. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a continuum of thought on that, but it does mean that, we are much more pro-choice than I think people would expect from sort of our political profile nationally. I think the first part of it is people feel relatively secure with Alaska and Alaska's constitution, which does explicitly protect choice. So that's kind of, item number one. Item number two is that Alaskans' politics is so much more three-dimensional than just thinking of moving left to right. It's, we're kind of a la carte. We might support Mary Peltola because we like her attitudes on fish. We might support Lisa Murkowski because of her seniority, and someone might support Mike Dunleavy because they say, hey, he handled COVID in a balanced way, and I really did get that $3,400 PFD. I mean, that's a pretty powerful piece of your campaign to land in someone's bank account weeks before the election. So I think there's a real plausible explanation. I can imagine a voter who ranked all three of them first, and it's not a leap to imagine that.
I know people who did that, many people.
Yeah.
So what do you think? This is a little bit in the weeds for folks, but I'm interested on your take on this. That there's a new freshman caucus that's formed. I don't know if this has been done in recent times, but I think they've got 13 people or something in this caucus. I oftentimes think, well, these are just going to be more meetings that people meet about to have other meetings. What are your thoughts on this kind of freshman group forming in Alaska? Do you think it's going to be beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, the top line for me would be when people talk to each other, it's always better. If these folks are socializing, having dinner together, you're going to find those odd places where they align and actually get stuff done. I do think that sort of the wide-eyed altruism will probably collide with caucus politics, partisan politics. Like there will be a rub at some point. But I will say I've met most of these freshmen I've met, and if I didn't know, because I'm terminally online and always following these things, I don't know in most cases if I'd be able to say that's the Democrat, that's the Republican. It's a lot of people who are running, and I like to say, there are people who run for the wrong reasons and the right reasons. The wrong reasons just being self-aggrandizement. They just want it for their ego. But most of these freshmen really seem to be there because they're like, I care about educating kids. I care about keeping the budget under control. I care about services. And with that much common ground, I'm pretty optimistic that to some degree, these relationships are genuine and will lead to good things. That being said, at some point we're going to have an on the floor meltdown between caucuses. Politics will happen. Yeah, it's going to happen. But what's refreshing, because when I worked as chief of staff to Governor Walker, I was sort of his primary legislative. Yeah, I was a tip of the spear on legislative negotiations. And without naming any names, I will not tell you how many times I would talk to a legislator and say, hey, can we support this other legislator's bill from the other caucus? It's common sense. And something would be raised to me like, no, one time 10 years ago, they snubbed me in the lunchroom, so forget it. I think fresh blood coming in where there's not a lot of that kind of nonsense, I think it's going to be real positive.
So what are you excited about with Alaska? What are some things that you think are on the horizon that are going to be good for Alaskans in general?
I mean, I do think, we're turning this corner. I think, I like to think optimistically on POMV and so forth, that we're not going to kill the golden goose. We will have the ability to support ourselves on into the future if we get it right. Now, that does require continuing to develop our resources in a reasonable way and so forth. But if we can really turn this corner, I mean, sky's the limit. We have more resources than any other state in the country. We've got a permanent fund that can largely not only support our services that we need, but also provide some injection of capital into every Alaskan's bank account. And then we've got the natural beauty, you see right out my window, who wouldn't trade places? Which state wouldn't trade places with us for that? I know I wouldn't. So I'm excited about that because tourism, if we do some of the things with developing LNG and hydrogen, we could start manufacturing. I think the governor's idea about carbon sequestration could revolutionize things. I mean, you could imagine piping LNG down to the Kenai Peninsula, using it to produce hydrogen and sequestering the carbon that's produced in that process. I mean, we could be the clean economy of the future. So that's all the excitement. I mean, the worried part of me is, what if, for reasons of failing to invest in workforce or childcare, what if we missed this golden opportunity and we sort of go back to being a colony where, outside interests come in, extract the resources, extract the value, and the Alaskans don't benefit. So I think we're on this nice edge of opportunity versus being exploited. but I like to remain optimistic that we're turning that corner towards opportunity.
I like that. What about the carbon credit thing? What's your take specifically on that? And maybe feel free to go in depth a little bit about it, because I think for a lot of folks, myself included, people that listen to Must Read Alaska, we kind of hear that and we're like, it kind of sounds like a fairy tale, green new idea that's never going to pan out. So talk to me a little bit about just, in general, what those are and what does it mean for Alaska if it were to go through?
Yeah. Well, I'll start first of all with kind of the framing device, which is, I believe we emit a lot of carbon. I believe that it has some impact on our climate. And so that's my starting point. Not everyone shares that, but I believe that to be true. Now, if carbon is impacting the environment and Alaska's, obviously on the front lines of climate change, what are we doing? Because we don't value carbon in a sense of it's an externality that's impacting our environment, but if you emit it, there's essentially no sanction. So we're asking Americans to be virtuous, reduce their carbon, and in the meantime, we're competing with other countries that emit carbon 3 to 4 times the rate doing the same activities. So what I know is we can't fight economically with one hand behind our back. So there does need to be a large solution, I think, at a federal level on how we value carbon, which would feed into there being a value in sequestering the carbon. Now, I will say, I share a little bit of your skepticism about this idea of carbon credits. Like, there certainly have been scams. If someone wants to build a factory outside LA and they say, well, I'm going to buy a 100-year lease on a stand of black spruce outside Fairbanks, and therefore I emitted no carbon. That's a fantasy. That doesn't. You and I know they're not cutting down that black spruce because the beetles are killing it. So they're not preserving a forest. That kind of stuff, there is a scam element to it. Now, if you're talking about scientifically sequestering carbon and it being embedded and bonded with the earth below Cook Inlet, that's real. That's not science fiction. That's real science. There are, preserving the Tongass. That's obviously a rainforest. That's meaningful. But I think we have to beware the snake oil element of all this. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, to me, all of this is going to come down to something they call a border carbon adjustment, which is whatever we're doing to ourselves on carbon, we have to make sure we're imposing that on the rest of the world. Otherwise, we're just asking other countries to dominate our economy. Now, if we say we're going to deal with carbon this way, and China, India, Russia, if you don't deal with it that way, we're going to assess you at the border with what they call a border carbon adjustment. Now, all of a sudden, our steel is more competitive than anyone else's in the country. Alaska's oil is actually produced with lower carbon than anywhere else in the world. All of a sudden, we're at the top. It sounds counterintuitive that, pricing carbon and putting some sort of carbon management scheme in effect could help us in Alaska, but it would, because we don't flare our gas largely. We have, we're not extracting oil from tar sands. We're extracting it from large pools of conventional oil. We have existing infrastructure, which is very efficient in taps to transport the oil. So that's the optimism part of it for me, is that if we make this shift, I don't know of anywhere better suited to it than Alaska.
Well, Scott, it's always good chatting with you. I think that, like I said before, when you're on, I think in December, I think more folks need to get together and chat that may not agree. And these kind of discussions help folks just understand where people are coming from. So I'm sure that I'm going to get some interesting responses, but I think that it's worth it because, people need to get together and chat. And so, Scott, I really appreciate you coming on the Must Read Alaska show.
Yeah, thanks, John. It's a pleasure. I'll see you soon.
Sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in to Must Read Alaska. And I'm going to have Mayor of the Mat-Su Borough on tomorrow. And then I'm going to have, who was I going to have on? I think I'm having Representative Jamie Allard on Friday. Then I do have somebody on Thursday as well. But we have a packed lineup this week, 6 shows this week. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Until next time, I'm John Quick from somewhere in Alaska.